Maybe it was there somewhere. I like technology, but I'm always afraid it's going to throw a wobbler and let me down right at the last minute. Okay, let's see how well you were listening. Can anybody remember where we finished off last week? I thought that would catch a few people out. Okay, we're starting chapter 5 tonight, and verse 1 to 4. Last week, we finished off by talking about Ezekiel surviving on a small amount of food and water, and that this was a prophetic message that the Israelites were going to suffer shortages because of the siege that they were going to endure. And we finished up by talking about sin having consequences. So I'll read the first 4 verses of chapter 5. Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair with fire inside the city. Take a third and strike it with the sword all around the city, and scatter a third to the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. But take a few strands of hair and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. A fire will spread from there to the whole house of Israel. Take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head. Well, it's a frightening thought to start with. You know, I have trouble sometimes with a razor blade that long, never mind one that long. I think you could give yourself a really serious shaving rash with one of those if you're not careful. To most people reading that today, in fairness, we'd skip right over it and probably miss its significance completely. Because it's no big deal, right? We get our hair cut all the time. Men, we shave our beards and moustaches all the time. So what's there to make a fuss about, really? Well, it would have been a big deal to Ezekiel. It would have been a really, really big deal to Ezekiel. To the Jews as a whole, really, but particularly to Ezekiel. The whole hair being shaved off, to them, was an extremely humiliating and significant experience. If you want to read up about that, you can find it in 2 Samuel chapter 10. And this was especially true in the case of a priest, because priests were forbidden to make themselves bald on their heads. The hair was a token of their consecration. And again, this prohibition, you can find it in Scripture, in Leviticus and chapter 19. And it says quickly that you shall not round the corners of your head, neither shall you mar the corners of your beard. They shall not make baldness upon their head, neither shall they shave off the corners of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. Now, it's likely that prohibitions against shaving stem from the fact that back in the times of the Bible, it was believed to be a pagan practice. It's believed that the Hittites, the Elamites, and the Sumerians were all clean-shaven, and the Egyptians also are portrayed as having cleanly cut, elongated goatee beards. And biblical scholars also believe that shaving the hair, particularly the corners of the beard, was a custom of mourning, to do with mourning. And this behavior it appears to have been practiced by other tribes other than Israel. And biblical scholars also have come to the conclusion that the regulations against shaving the hair may well be an attack on the practice of offering hair to the dead, which was common amongst other nations at the time. It was believed to provide protection for people in Sheol. So the bottom line is that as far as Ezekiel is concerned, making yourself bald and shaving your beard off was an absolute no-no, and particularly for Ezekiel being a priest. And I can imagine, in fairness to the man, that he must have been mortified when God told him to take this sword and shave his head and his beard. You know, in a way, I feel for Ezekiel, because there he is one day by the side of the river, minding his own business, doing whatever priestly things Ezekiel was doing at the time. And the next, he's experienced this awesome and completely overwhelming presence of God twice. He's been told to cook his food using human dung and shave his head and his beard completely, all in the space of 2 weeks. Now, it doesn't get much more traumatic than that. And as far as cooking your food and shaving is concerned, for Ezekiel, it couldn't have got more humiliating than that. But it's only when we sit down and think about this. You know, I think everyone should meditate on these experiences of Ezekiel at some time or another and really think about them and meditate on them. Because we need to get an idea of how absolutely traumatizing this was for Ezekiel to do. Because it's only when we appreciate how traumatizing it was for him that we can appreciate his determination and obedience to God. To do what God told him, whatever the cost. And it was quite a cost for him. So as far as God conveying a message out of all this is concerned, shaving the hair and the beard was a sign of shame, and the sword was a symbol of death and devastation. So God is showing the Israelites through these actions of Ezekiel the level of shame and death and devastation that they were going to be suffering. And you know, God didn't do this with the idea of embarrassing Ezekiel in mind. That was not the primary reason for all this. And in fact, this whole business of shaving is talked about elsewhere in the Bible. If you look at Isaiah and chapter 7, and it says, "In that same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard." So it's not something random. This is something that prophets have already spoken about to the people of Israel. A prophecy, you could say perhaps, that is now being stated again, not only by words, but by means of this action of Ezekiel shaving himself, his head and his beard, in front of the people. And let's be honest, over the years, God has given the people of Israel and the people of Judah plenty of opportunity to see the error of their ways. He's given them plenty of warning as to what will happen if they don't. And now we see God telling the people of Judah not what would happen if they didn't repent, but what is going to happen because they haven't repented. Take a set of scales and divide up the hair. It gets weirder, doesn't it? I can imagine what Ezekiel was thinking. Divide my hair up? And God is very specific about what he wants done with this hair. He wanted Ezekiel to divide the hair into thirds, using a scale to divide it accurately. This implies, I guess, that the Lord is fair and just when he weighs out the portion of punishment that is due. The punishment that is allotted to each of the hairs, and not one will be allowed to escape. And after weighing it and splitting it, he's given instructions what to do with it. He's told, when the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair inside the city. Take a third and strike it with a sword all around the city, and scatter a third to the wind. And then he's also to take a few of these hairs and tuck them into the folds of his garment. But even a few of these are to be burned in the fire. Now, it doesn't take much of imagination to transfer what's happening with those hair to what's going to be happening to the people in the city of Jerusalem. And as I sit there reading it and letting my imagination run wild, and I've got quite a good imagination, I see pictures of men dying on the ramparts as the enemy is storming the city. The women and children running through the city streets screaming as they're pursued by enemy fighters who are bent on killing them. And the whole city in flames. This whole episode that Ezekiel is told to embark on by God is meant to give the people of Judah a vivid, real picture of what is going to happen. Some Bible commentator has put it like this: here is a new emblem produced in order to mark out the coming evils. 1, the prophet represents the Jewish nation. 2, the hair is the people. 3, the razor, the Chaldeans. 4, the cutting of the beard and the hair represent the calamities, sorrows and disgrace that come upon the people. He's ordered to divide the hair into 3 equal parts to intimate the different degrees and kinds of punishment which would fall upon the people. The balances or scales were to represent the divine justice and the exactness with which God's judgments should be distributed among the offenders. The hair, divided into 3 parts, is disposed of thus. A third part is to be burned in the midst of the city to show that so many should perish by famine and pestilence during the siege. Another third part was cut into small portions about the city. That figure which he had portrayed upon the brick, the city of Jerusalem, to signify those who should perish in different sorties and in defending the walls. And the remaining third he was to scatter in the wind, to point out those who should be driven into captivity. And the sword following them was intended to show that their lives should be at the will of their captors, and that many of them should perish by the sword in their dispersions. A few hairs which he was to take in his clothes was intended to represent those few Jews that would be left in the land under Gedaliah after taking the city. And Gedaliah, you probably remember, was killed eventually by Ishmael ben Netaniah, who was an obscure descendant of David and a member of the royal family of Judah. And they'd fled into Transjordan at the first sign of this trouble to save their own skins. And so this man Gedaliah had been appointed by Judah's enemies to rule the area on their behalf. And you know, we should talk about this episode with Gedaliah a little bit because it's important. It's important, I think, to know why the murder of this man Gedaliah was so important that it counted as rebellion against God to be punished. There's even a fast which is after the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and shortly before Yom Kippur, and it's called the fast of Tzom Gedaliah, the fast of Gedaliah, and it commemorates the murder of this man who was a commoner and a civil servant. So the fact that the Jews are commemorating it in itself tells you that it's a significant episode. Now then, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem in 597 BC. They took away the king Jehoiakim and appointed Zedekiah, his uncle, in his place. But when he rebelled some 10 years later by joining with Egypt, they came back and destroyed the city and the temple in 586 BC. This time, they ignored the royal family and appointed their own civil servant, Gedaliah, to rule the province. His name was Gedaliah Akahim ben Shaphan. His father, Akahim ben Shaphan, was also a senior civil servant, and he was the one who had saved Jeremiah from the people under the previous reign. Both Ahikam and his father Shaphan, the royal scribe, had been sent by King Josiah to check the scroll of the law that the priest Hilkiah had found while repairing the temple. So you can see this gentleman, Gedaliah, his father and his grandfather were a distinguished ministerial line, but not a royal one. But they've already had a part to play in the history of Israel and Judah. And for all we know, Gedaliah may well have been God's choice to be governor in Israel at the time, until he restored them again. We don't know. That's just a speculation. But God works in mysterious ways. But it does seem that Gedaliah was a decent guy, and he worked hard to put some kind of life back into the city and the area. And it seems that the people came out of hiding and respected him. They respected him, but they didn't respect their own royal family. Some of them had been deported, but those that hadn't, what we would call the minor royals, had fled to Transjordan to save their own skins. They'd abandoned their own people to their plight. But now things have settled down a bit. Peace has sort of come back to Jerusalem. Things aren't so dangerous as they had been. And guess what? Envy and jealousy replaces the fear. And envy and jealousy led them come back to attack Gedaliah and to murder him. And the simple bottom line is that assassination changed Jewish history. That is why he's important. That is why he's commemorated. It's amazing, really, what you can get out of the Bible when you dig into it, isn't it? Really. You read these little things as stories, and seemingly they don't mean much. But when you start to picture the whole story together, suddenly it's amazing how God works, even amongst people who don't follow him. Okay, let's pick up again now at verse 5. I'll read through to verse 8. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations, with countries all around her. Yet in her wickedness she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the other nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and has not followed my decrees. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You have been more unruly than the nations around you and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. You have not even conformed to the standards of the nations around you. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. So now God switches from telling Ezekiel to do, as he acts out the siege of Jerusalem, to talking about Jerusalem itself, and by definition the people who live there in Jerusalem. He says, this is Jerusalem which I have set in the center of the nations with countries all around her. And you know, in many ways this is true, both in a historical and redemptive sense. Israel has been at the center of God's plan and work in the world. But in many senses it's also true geographically, because Israel stands at the meeting point of continents and empires, the center of the world, you could say. And it's no accident that Jerusalem is the capital of Judah, that it's the most important city as far as the Israelites and the Judeans were concerned. It's no accident that the city of David was named after a man after God's own heart. One Bible commentator puts it like this: Jerusalem is regarded in God's point of view as the center of the whole earth, designed to radiate the true light over the nations in all directions. No center in the heathen world would have been selected more fitted than Cana to be a vantage ground from where the people of God could have acted with success upon the so-called heathen nations of the world. Jerusalem lay midway between the oldest and most civilized states, Egypt and Ethiopia on one side, and Babylon and Nineveh and India on the other, and later on Persia, Greece and Rome. The Phoenician mariners were close by, through whom they could have taken the true religion to the remotest lands. And all around the Israelites, the great inland traders in South Asia and North Africa. Israel was where it was, not for its own selfish good, but to be the spiritual center, the spiritual benefactor of the whole world. But unfortunately, it all goes wrong. But that's no surprise to God, because he knew very well it was going to go wrong. And it went wrong, unfortunately, by the rebellion and disobedience of the very people he had chosen to be a light to the world. Failing in their role, their God-given role as a light to the heathens, and falling into idolatry, God tells them that they are worse than the people around them. That its guilt was far more than that of the heathen. What God is saying about his own people is that the heathens around them are far more zealous for their false gods than Israel is for the one true God. That's a damning indictment, really, isn't it? Charles Ellicott, theologian and churchman, puts it like this: it certainly is not true that the Israelites as a nation habitually committed sins which were, in themselves, considered of greater enormity than the abominations of the heathen. Nor is it to be supposed that they were originally chosen of God because they had a worse disposition than any other people. So how then did they come to be regarded by him as worse? And how did they come to have a greater proclivity to evil? The law of the moral government in the world, that responsibility is proportioned to privilege. It's much insisted upon in Scripture, and hence the neglect or misuse of privilege leads to a severer condemnation than if a privilege had never been given. The Israelites were God's covenant-chosen people. They had entered willingly into this covenant with God, and they promised to keep the terms of that covenant. God told them from the start that obedience would bring blessings, but disobedience would bring punishment. But the Israelites still allowed pride to get the best of them, puffing up their chests, and we are God's chosen people. That makes us better than you. And in their pride, they were counting on this special relationship with God to keep them out of trouble, even though they failed to fulfill the terms of a covenant they had set up with God. Although it's not believed that the Israelites ever went beyond the heathen in abominable idolatries, the corruption of that, which in itself is supposed to be best, is worse than the corruption of that which is less perfect. God can and does help and forgive those who try to follow his laws, but fail occasionally. But the Israelites refused to even try. They deliberately chose what the nations around them had to offer over what God had to offer. And it's that deliberate choosing of the world over their God and their refusal to turn back that God led them to God calling them stubborn and rebellious. And don't forget, the people of Judah knew what God wanted them to do, because Josiah had rediscovered the book of the law in 622 and read it to the people of Jerusalem. And that was only about 50 years or so before these events. Josiah's grandfather and great-grandfather Hezekiah were also aware of God's commands, so it passed down through the family, so they knew very well what God was asking of them. And more than that, they were repeatedly warned the consequences of not obeying God. However, and this is a familiar theme, unfortunately, around the Bible, the response to these messages of warnings was to persecute and kill the messengers. Now, another thing we need to remember, really, is that they were living in a time where the heathen nations around Israel and Judah believed that their gods could be vengeful and inflicted punishment on them if they didn't do what they were told. So they would have had no trouble at all in believing that the Israelites were being punished by their God. That would have been obvious to them. And I believe that also was part of God's plan, because Israel's suffering for her sins under their God's wrath would be an object lesson to the nations around. They would be only too aware that they were being punished for not doing what their God has asked them to do. Do you know, sometimes when I think about the Israelites, you can relate what happened to being a parent of a teenager, because you can see where they're heading. You can see them on the slippery path. You try and correct them, and they slap you. I'm a teenager. I'm grown up. I can make my own decisions. Leave me alone. And so you have to step back and let them get on with it. And it grieves you. And eventually, when it goes wrong, when their train comes off the rails, sometimes they come back to you and ask for help. Often they don't. And I can imagine that's exactly what God felt like with the Israelites. They were his teenagers, refusing to do what God knew was best. And in the end, God simply stepped back and said, okay, get on with it.
And Steve, likewise, when you try and instill discipline in your teenage child, they see it as a restriction.
Absolutely.
Rather than a freedom.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what the Israelites did as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. So it's a mess. Let's go a bit longer. I'll read verse 9 and 10. Because of all your detestable idols, I will do to you what I have never done before and will never do again. Therefore, in your midst, fathers will eat their children, and children will eat their fathers. I will inflict punishment on you and will scatter all your survivors to the winds. Yes, it is. Because of your detestable idols, I will do what I have never done before and will never do again. That sentence on its own sounds like something awful is going to happen. And it did. And do you know one thing that bothered me for a long, long time was the fact that how could a God that I worship be so cruel as to make people eat their own children? But you know, the truth is, he didn't make them eat their own children. All he did was step back out of the way, withdraw his hand of protection and his hand of blessing. The rest of it was just mankind's sinful nature taking over and doing what men will do if they're left to their own devices. But I've mentioned this before, and I'll say it again. You have to look at what the Bible doesn't say as well as what it says. And if you read that passage there, it doesn't say, I will cause children to eat their fathers and fathers to eat their children. It simply says it will happen. And so that again is proof, if you need it, that is not actually God making it happen. God has just stepped back, withdrawn his hand of protection and blessing to let them get on with it. And sinful humans being what we are, that is the kind of thing that happens if you put people in a siege situation and stress them.
It's the thing that God will never do again is withdraw his hand.
Yes, basically. And there are 3 verses in Romans that would explain what we've just been saying. Romans chapter 1 and verse 24. Therefore God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. Verse 26. For this reason God gave him over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. Verse 28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. So there's a general principle that if we don't obey God, he hands us over to our own devices. He steps back and says, okay, you've got the gift of free will, get on with it. And it grieves him as much as it grieves us to watch our teenage children go down the wrong road. Okay, I'm going to read something now. John MacArthur, his commentary on Romans 1. Therefore, God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. This, therefore, refers to the reasons Paul had set out previously in verses 18 to 23. Although God reveals himself to man, man rejected God and then rationalized his rejection and created substitute gods of his own making. And because man abandoned God, God abandoned men. He gave them over. God's giving over sinful mankind has a dual sense. First, in an indirect sense, God gave them over simply by withdrawing his restraining and protective hand and allowing the consequences of sin to take their inevitable destructive course. In a second, direct sense, God gave over rebellious mankind by specific acts of judgment. And the Bible is full of accounts of divine wrath being directly and supernaturally poured out on sinful men. The flood of Noah's day, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example. They were not indirect, natural consequences of sin, but they were overt, supernatural expressions of God's judgment on a gross and unrepentant sin. He then goes on to say that sin degrades man, debases the image of God in which he is made, and strips him of dignity, peace of mind, and a clear conscience. Sin destroys personal relationships, marriages, families, cities, and nations, and it also destroys churches. Fallen men are not concerned about their sin, but only about the pain from the unpleasant consequences sin brings about. Someone has well said that sin would have fewer takers if the consequences were immediate. Many people, for example, are greatly concerned about VD, but resent the suggestion of avoiding it by restraining sexual promiscuity and subversions. So instead of adhering to God's standards of moral purity, they attempt to remove the consequences of their impurity. They turn to counseling, to medicine, to psychoanalysts, to drugs, to alcohol, to travel, and a host of other means to escape which cannot be escaped except by the removal of their sin. And that is exactly how the people of Judah have ended up in the position of God being angry with them, turning their backs on God to do as the nations around them do. But you know, what a good God we serve, because even to the very end, God's offer of grace is good. Think of the thief on the cross. The very last hours of his life, Jesus said to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Even at the 11th hour, they could have stopped this judgment. All they had to do was turn back to God. But they didn't. They wouldn't. They continued to do just what John MacArthur said, to try and remove the consequences of their sin on their own. And the end result was that God withdrew his protection and support and allowed their enemies to come against them, to overwhelm them. And in the face of such catastrophe, they simply behaved in the way sinful people will behave, without God behind them, including eating their children and each other. And don't forget, there is a historical evidence of child sacrifice and cannibalism in many nations at that time. So it's not something strange. It's something that the people of Judah would have known about. Okay, I think I'll call it a night there, if you don't mind us. Long enough.